All my life I heard confessions, sins whispered in the dark, buried under silence. They said I betrayed my vows, that I broke God's trust. Maybe I did, but the only way to serve the truth.
My name is Father Michael Brennan, and for 23 years I served St. Catherine's Parish in Millbrook, Vermont. A small town where everyone knew everyone, where Sunday Mass was as much a social gathering as a spiritual one, where the confessional booth was the keeper of the town's deepest secrets. I took my vows seriously. The seal of confession was sacred to me, an unbreakable bond between a penitent soul and God. I'd heard it all over the years: adultery, theft, lies that destroyed families, addictions that consumed lives. I listened, I counseled, I prayed with them, and I never, ever spoke a word of what was confessed to me, until that October evening in 2019. It was a Tuesday. The church was quiet, bathed in the amber light of late afternoon filtering through stained glass windows. I'd just finished evening prayers when I heard the confessional door creak open. Someone entering at an unusual hour, but not unheard of. I slid into my side of the booth, adjusted my stole, and waited. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." The voice was familiar. Robert Hastings, 42 years old, married with 2 daughters, worked as a manager at the local credit union. A regular parishioner, though not one who came to confession often. His voice trembled as he spoke, and I could hear him struggling to breathe steadily. "It's been 6 months since my last confession," he continued. "Father, I don't know how to say this." I offered the usual comfort. "God already knows what's in your heart, Robert. You're here because you want to make it right. Speak freely." There was a long silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I hurt someone, a child." My blood went cold. "Father, I've been doing things to my daughter's friend. She's 11. She stays over sometimes, and when everyone's asleep, He broke down, sobbing, but continued. The details he confessed were horrifying: systematic abuse, manipulation, threats to keep her silent. He said he wanted to stop, that he was disgusted with himself, that he needed God's forgiveness. I sat frozen in that confessional booth, my hands gripping the wooden armrest so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind raced. This wasn't a sin of weakness or a moment of moral failure. This was ongoing criminal abuse of an innocent child, a child who was, at that very moment, still in danger. I knew the law. I knew my vows. In most states, clergy members are mandated reporters for child abuse, but the seal of confession, the absolute confidentiality of the sacrament, was considered inviolable by the church. Priests had gone to jail rather than break it. It was one of the oldest and most sacred traditions of our faith. But as Robert Hastings continued his confession, detailing the times and ways he'd violated this little girl's trust and innocence, something inside me shattered. I thought about that child. Did she feel safe anywhere? Did she know that while she slept under that roof, she was being preyed upon by someone who should have protected her? Did she blame herself? Did she think no one would believe her? When Robert finished, he asked for absolution. He asked for penance. He asked what prayers he should say to be forgiven. I gave him the only answer I could at that moment. What you've confessed requires more than prayers, Robert. This child needs protection. You need professional help, and you need to turn yourself in to the authorities. He was silent for a moment. Then, "But Father, this is confession. You can't tell anyone. You can't." "You're right about what I can and cannot do according to church law," I said slowly. "But I'm also telling you what you must do. If you don't protect this child, you're not truly repentant." He left the confessional abruptly. I heard his footsteps echo through the empty church, then the heavy door closing behind him. I sat alone in the darkness of that booth, knowing that my life was about to change forever, because I had already made my decision. I didn't sleep that night. I paced my small rectory apartment, the words of Robert Hastings' confession echoing in my mind. I prayed. I read scripture. I searched for answers in the texts that had guided me my entire priesthood. But no matter how many times I read about forgiveness, mercy, and the sanctity of confession, I kept coming back to one image: a terrified 11-year-old girl who had no voice and no protection. By dawn, I knew what I had to do, even though it would cost me everything. At 7:30 a.m., I called Detective Sarah Chen at the Millbrook Police Department. She and I had worked together before on a community outreach program, and I trusted her integrity. When she answered, I could barely get the words out. "Sarah, I need to report a case of ongoing child sexual abuse." There was a pause. "Okay, Father. Can you tell me what you know?" "I received information that a man in our community has been abusing an 11-year-old girl. Multiple incidents. It's still happening. The child is in immediate danger. Who is the victim? Who is the perpetrator?" This was the moment, the point of no return. "The perpetrator is Robert Hastings. He lives at 347 Maple Drive. I don't know the identity of the victim, only that she's a friend of his daughter who stays over at their house." "Father, how did you come by this information?" I closed my eyes. "He told me, in confession." The line went silent. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was different, careful, measured. "Father Brennan, you understand what you're saying? You're breaking the seal of confession." "I understand completely. This is going to become very complicated very quickly." "I know. But a child is being hurt, Sarah. Every day that passes, she's being hurt. I can't stand before God, knowing I had the power to protect her and chose not to." Sarah said she would investigate immediately, but warned me that I should contact a lawyer. "The church would likely take action against me, and Robert Hastings, if charged, would certainly challenge the evidence as inadmissible." She was right on both counts. Within hours, the Archdiocese was informed. By that afternoon, I received a call from Bishop Thomas Morrison, demanding I come to his office immediately. By evening, news had spread through Millbrook like wildfire, the small-town rumor mill working at maximum efficiency. The town of Millbrook may be small, but its secrets run deep. Stories like this could happen anywhere, in your city, in your neighborhood. Have you ever witnessed something that made you question where your loyalty should lie? What city are you watching this from? Drop the name in the comments. I read every single one, and your perspective matters in stories like these. Within 24 hours, the police had identified the victim, Emma Richardson, daughter of Linda and James Richardson, who lived 3 houses down from the Hastings family. Emma and Robert's daughter Madison were best friends. They had sleepovers twice a month. When the police interviewed Emma with a trained child forensic specialist present, the truth came pouring out. She'd been too terrified to tell anyone. Robert had told her that if she spoke up, no one would believe her, that her parents would be angry with her, that it would destroy Madison's family. She'd carried this burden alone for nearly a year. The relief on that child's face when she realized she was finally believed, finally safe. That image sustained me through everything that came after. But the cost was immediate and severe. The Archdiocese suspended me from all priestly duties pending an investigation. Bishop Morrison made it clear in our meeting that I had committed one of the gravest violations possible in Catholic ministry. "The seal of confession has been maintained for over 1,000 years, he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Men have been martyred rather than break it, and you broke it over a phone call." "A child was being raped," I responded, repeatedly. "What would you have had me do?" "Encouraged him to turn himself in, worked with him spiritually, found another way. Any way but this. I tried that. He left the confessional and had no intention of stopping." The bishop shook his head. "Your intentions may have been noble, Father Brennan, but you've opened a door that cannot be closed. Do you understand the precedent this sets?" I understood, but I also understood that Emma Richardson could now sleep safely at night. Robert Hastings was arrested on October 24, 2019, and charged with multiple counts of sexual assault of a minor. And then the real battle began. The morning after Robert's arrest, I found my car spray-painted with one word: Judas. I stood in the church parking lot, staring at the crude letters dripping down the driver's side door. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. To many in the community, and within the church itself, I was a betrayer. Someone who had sold out the sacred trust of the confessional for 30 pieces of silver, or in this case, for what I believed was the greater good. The town split down the middle. Half the community saw me as a hero who'd saved a child from ongoing abuse. Mothers stopped me on the street to shake my hand with tears in their eyes. Linda Richardson came to the rectory and fell into my arms, sobbing with gratitude and guilt that she hadn't seen what was happening to her daughter under her own nose. But the other half saw me as something far more dangerous, a priest who couldn't be trusted, who'd violated the oldest and most sacred bond between a confessor and the church. If I could break the seal for Robert Hastings, who else's sins might I reveal? Who else's secrets might I expose? Attendance at St. Catherine's dropped by 40% within 2 weeks. Parishioners who'd attended Mass every Sunday for decades simply stopped coming. I'd overhear conversations in the grocery store that went quiet when I approached. Anonymous letters arrived at the rectory, some supporting me, others condemning me to hell in graphic detail. The most painful rejection came from people I'd known for years. Tom Sullivan, a man whose wife I'd buried and whose children I'd baptized, crossed the street to avoid me. When I called out to him, he turned and said, "I don't know you anymore, Father. I thought I did, but I don't." Margaret O'Brien, who'd arranged flowers in the church for 20 years, left a letter saying she could no longer serve in a parish led by someone who'd betrayed the sacraments. "You're not just putting Robert's confession at risk," she wrote. "You're telling all of us that nothing we say is truly safe." The hate mail was one thing, but it was the fear in people's eyes that hurt most. The worry that their own confessions over the years might not be as protected as they'd believed. The archdiocese moved swiftly. Within 3 weeks, I was officially removed from my position at St. Catherine's and placed on indefinite administrative leave. Bishop Morrison assigned a new priest to the parish and issued a statement emphasizing that my actions do not reflect the teachings or practices of the Catholic Church. I was essentially in exile, living in a small apartment the diocese provided while they decided my fate. No masses to say, no confessions to hear, no baptisms, weddings, or funerals to preside over. The structure that had defined my entire adult life, gone. But the legal system moved forward. Robert Hastings' defense attorney, Marcus Whitfield, immediately filed a motion to suppress my testimony and any evidence derived from it. His argument was clear and compelling. The confession was privileged communication, protected by both religious doctrine and Vermont law. If my testimony was allowed, it would set a precedent that would undermine religious freedom across the country. "Your Honor," Whitfield argued at the preliminary hearing, "we cannot allow the state to compel religious leaders to violate their sacred oaths. Today, it's a Catholic priest and the seal of confession. Tomorrow, it might be forcing rabbis to reveal private counseling sessions or imams to report spiritual discussions. The First Amendment protects religious practice for a reason." The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, countered with equal force. "Your Honor, Vermont law makes clergy mandated reporters of child abuse with limited exceptions. Father Brennan had a legal duty to report. More importantly, we're not talking about abstract religious freedom. We're talking about a child who was being repeatedly assaulted. The defendant himself admits the abuse occurred. We have the victim's testimony, medical evidence, and forensic proof. Father Brennan's initial report merely started the investigation. Judge Catherine Reeves, a stern woman in her mid-60s who'd presided over the county court for 20 years, took the matter under advisement. "This court recognizes the serious constitutional questions at play," she said. "I'll issue a ruling within 30 days. Those 30 days felt like 30 years. I spent them in prayer, in doubt, and in constant second-guessing. Had I done the right thing? The legal right thing? The moral right thing? Were those even the same? Late one night my phone rang. It was Father David Martinez, an old friend from seminary who now taught canon law at Georgetown University. "Michael, I heard what happened," he said. "How are you holding up?" "Honestly, David, I don't know. I keep asking myself if I made the right choice." "Let me ask you something," David said gently. "If you could go back to that moment in the confessional, knowing everything you know now, the suspension, the division in your parish, the legal battle, would you make the same choice?" I thought about Emma Richardson. I thought about the relief on her face when she finally told her truth. I thought about the fact that she was now safe, in counseling, beginning to heal. "Yes," I said, "I would." "Then you have your answer. The consequences don't determine whether it was right. The truth does, but the church didn't see it that way. Judge Reeves issued her ruling on November 29, 2019, and it shook both the legal and religious communities across the nation. She ruled that my testimony would be admissible. In a carefully worded 40-page decision, Judge Reeves acknowledged the sanctity of religious confession, but noted that Vermont law explicitly includes clergy among mandated reporters of child abuse. She wrote, "While this court respects the ancient tradition of the confessional seal, it cannot and will not create a shield behind which ongoing crimes against children can hide. Religious freedom is not absolute when it conflicts with the state's compelling interest in protecting its most vulnerable citizens." She went further. The defendant in this case used the confessional not as a means of genuine repentance, but as a way to disclose his crimes while ensuring silence. This represents a perversion of the sacrament, not a sacred use of it. Father Brennan's decision to report was not only legally required, but morally necessary. The decision made national headlines. Vermont judge rules against confessional seal in child abuse case. Priest who broke confession, seal wins court approval. Religious freedom versus child safety, a landmark ruling. The Catholic Church responded immediately. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops issued a statement calling the ruling a dangerous erosion of religious liberty and announced they would support an appeal. Cardinal William Bennett, one of the most influential voices in American Catholicism, called me personally. "Father Brennan," his voice was measured but cold, "do you understand what you've done? This ruling will be cited in cases across the country. You've weakened the protection of the confessional for every Catholic in America. Your Eminence, with respect, I protected a child from ongoing sexual assault, and in doing so, you may have harmed millions of Catholics who rely on the absolute confidentiality of confession to seek spiritual healing. Did you consider that?" "Every single day," I said quietly. "But I also consider Emma Richardson every single day. She's 11 years old, Cardinal. She has her whole life ahead of her now because someone finally protected her. The Church has protocols for these situations. The protocols failed her. They've failed hundreds of children over the years. We both know that." There was a long silence. When Cardinal Bennett spoke again, his voice was softer but no less firm. "The canonical trial will proceed. You will likely be laicized, removed from the priesthood permanently. Are you prepared for that?" "I've been preparing since the moment I made the call, but knowing it was coming didn't make it easier. The canonical trial, the Church's internal process for judging violations of sacred law, began in January 2020. It was held in the Archdiocese offices in Burlington, presided over by a tribunal of 3 priests and 2 canon lawyers. The promoter of justice, essentially the prosecutor in canon law, laid out the case against me with clinical precision. I had violated Canon 983. The sacramental seal is inviolable, therefore it is absolutely forbidden for a confessor to betray in any way a penitent in words or in any manner and for any reason. There was no ambiguity, no wiggle room. I had heard a confession and revealed its contents to civil authorities. Under canon law, this carried the penalty of automatic excommunication, late sententiae, meaning it took effect the moment I committed the act. My canonical defender, Father James O'Connor, argued that I had acted under duress of conscience and moral obligation. He cited Canon 1323, which provides exceptions for actions taken under necessity or to avoid grave harm. Father Brennan was faced with an impossible choice, he argued. Remain silent and allow ongoing abuse, or speak and violate the seal. He chose to protect the innocent, which is fundamentally aligned with the gospel message. But the tribunal was unmoved. Father Theodore Walsh, the presiding judge, delivered their decision in early February. The seal of confession exists for the protection of the penitent and the integrity of the sacrament. It is not contingent on the nature of the sin confessed. While we acknowledge Father Brennan's difficult position and his stated desire to protect a child, we cannot condone his actions. The seal must be absolute, or it ceases to have meaning. I was formally laicized, stripped of my priesthood, and returned to the status of a lay person. 23 years of ministry, gone. I could no longer celebrate Mass, could no longer hear confessions, could no longer perform any priestly functions. In the eyes of the Church, I was no longer Father Michael Brennan. I was just Michael. The civil trial against Robert Hastings, meanwhile, moved toward its conclusion. The defense fought hard to keep my testimony out, appealing Judge Reeves's decision to the Vermont Supreme Court. But they ultimately lost. The higher court affirmed that the state's interest in protecting children superseded religious privilege in cases of ongoing abuse. With that legal obstacle removed, the trial itself became almost anticlimactic. The trial of Robert Hastings began on March 2, 2020, just as the world was beginning to hear unsettling news about a virus spreading from China. The Millbrook County Courthouse, a stern brick building that had stood since 1887, became ground zero for a community's reckoning. Media trucks lined the street outside. Protesters held signs on both sides of the issue. One group held images of children with the words, "Protect the innocent." Another held crosses and signs reading, "Religious freedom matters" and "Confession is sacred." I sat in the witness waiting room, my hands folded in my lap, no longer wearing the black shirt and white collar that had defined me for over 2 decades. I wore a simple suit and tie, just another civilian about to testify in a criminal trial. Linda Richardson sat across from me, Emma's mother. Her eyes were rimmed with red from weeks of crying, but there was steel in her expression now. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for Emma, for not looking away. How is she doing? She has nightmares. She's in therapy 3 times a week. She doesn't trust easily anymore." Linda's voice broke slightly. "But she's safe. She knows people believe her now. She knows it wasn't her fault. That's because of you." When I was called to testify, the courtroom fell silent. Ada Jennifer Walsh led me through the preliminary questions, my name, my former position, my years of service. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. "Father Brennan," "I'm sorry, Mr. Brennan, can you tell the court what happened on October 22, 2019? I took a breath and told the truth. I described the confession in as little detail as possible, focusing only on what was necessary to establish the facts, that Robert Hastings had admitted to ongoing sexual abuse of a minor, that he'd provided specific details, and that he'd indicated the abuse was continuing. Marcus Whitfield, the defense attorney, was ready for his cross-examination. "Mr. Brennan, you took a vow when you became a priest, didn't you?" "I took several, but one of them was to maintain the seal of confession, correct?" "Correct. And you were taught that this seal was absolute, yes? That it could never be broken under any circumstances?" "That's what I was taught. So when you broke that seal, you knew you were violating one of the most sacred oaths of your priesthood?" "I did, and yet you did it anyway. Tell me, Mr. Brennan, what other vows or promises might you be willing to break when it suits your personal judgment?" Ada Walsh objected, but the damage was done. Whitfield was establishing me as someone who couldn't be trusted to keep his word. "Mr. Brennan," Whitfield continued, "isn't it true that you have a personal belief that the Church has mishandled abuse cases? It's not just a belief. It's a documented fact, but you have strong feelings about it. Yes, strong enough that you might hear a confession and interpret it in the worst possible light. Strong enough that you might even embellish what was said. I did not embellish anything. I reported exactly what was confessed. But we only have your word for that, don't we? My client can't testify about what was said in the confessional without incriminating himself. There's no recording, no witnesses, just your version of events. He was right, of course. If the case had rested solely on my testimony, it might have fallen apart right there. But it didn't, because Emma Richardson testified. When the 11-year-old girl took the stand, testifying via closed-circuit television to protect her from the trauma of facing her abuser, she told her story with heartbreaking clarity. She described the abuse in age-appropriate language, but with unmistakable truth. She explained how Robert had manipulated her, threatened her, convinced her that speaking up would destroy her best friend's family. The medical evidence corroborated her testimony. A forensic psychologist confirmed that her statements bore all the hallmarks of truthful disclosure. The timeline matched, the details were consistent, and then the prosecution introduced their final piece of evidence: text messages found on Robert Hastings's phone. Messages to himself, documenting what he called his demons and his inability to stop. Messages that read like a confession all their own. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Robert Hastings was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for 15 years. Judge Reeves, in delivering the sentence, looked directly at him and said, "You violated the trust of a child, of a family, and of a community. You used their faith and friendship as tools for your crime. The sentence reflects the gravity of that betrayal." As the bailiff led him away, Robert Hastings looked back at me one time. I couldn't read his expression. Hatred, regret, blame, maybe all three. I felt no triumph, only exhaustion and a profound sadness. The conviction should have been the end of the story, but in many ways it was just the beginning of my real trial. The weeks following the verdict were brutal. The national media attention intensified, and I found myself at the center of a cultural firestorm that stretched far beyond the borders of Millbrook, Vermont. Conservative Catholic organizations condemned me publicly. The Catholic League issued a statement calling me a cautionary tale of personal judgment, superseding sacred tradition. Several prominent Catholic commentators wrote opinion pieces arguing that I had done irreparable harm to the Church's relationship with its faithful. "If Catholics cannot trust the confessional," one article read, "then we've lost one of the sacrament's most vital functions, providing a safe space for sinners to seek redemption." Father Brennan didn't just break one man's confession, he broke the trust of millions. But there were other voices too. Survivors of clergy sexual abuse reached out to me by the hundreds. Emails, letters, phone calls from people who'd been abused as children and never believed, never protected. They saw my choice as validation that someone in the church had finally put children first. "For the first time in my life," one woman wrote, "I feel like a priest actually protected a child instead of protecting the institution. Thank you for showing that the church can choose the right thing." Mental health professionals, child advocates, and legal experts wrote articles supporting my decision. The debate raged across newspaper editorial pages, television news programs, and social media platforms. Was I a hero or a heretic? A whistleblower or a betrayer? The answer, I realized, depended entirely on what someone valued most: institutional religious tradition or individual human welfare. My own feelings were complicated. I grieved the loss of my priesthood deeply. For 23 years, my identity had been inextricably tied to my role as Father Michael Brennan. I'd celebrated thousands of masses, heard countless confessions, presided over weddings and funerals, baptized children and guided teenagers through confirmation. Ministry wasn't just what I did, it was who I was. Now, I was nobody. No parish, no congregation, no collar, no title. I took a job at a local hardware store to pay rent. The manager, Dave Stevens, was a Lutheran who'd followed the trial closely. "I don't care what the church says," he told me when he hired me. "You did the right thing. You're welcome here." Working the paint counter at Stevens Hardware was a strange new reality. Customers who recognized me would sometimes whisper to each other. A few would approach to shake my hand. Others would avoid me entirely, leaving their paint cans and walking out. One Saturday afternoon, Margaret O'Brien, the woman who'd resigned from arranging flowers at St. Catherine's, came in to buy gardening supplies. She froze when she saw me behind the counter, her hand gripping her cart. "Hello, Margaret," I said quietly. She stared at me for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, her eyes filled with tears. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I was so worried about the principle of it all that I forgot about that little girl. My granddaughter is 11. If someone knew she was being hurt and didn't tell, I'd never forgive them. You don't have to apologize." "Yes, I do. You lost everything to protect a child. I lost nothing and judged you for it." She reached across the counter and squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry." These small moments of reconciliation sustained me, but they didn't erase the larger isolation. I'd lost not just my job and title, but my community, my identity, and my sense of purpose. I attended Mass at St. Catherine's occasionally, sitting in the back pew like any other parishioner. It felt strange, alien even, to watch someone else at the altar, to kneel for communion I couldn't distribute, to hear confessions being heard behind a screen where I'd once sat. Father David Martinez, my friend from seminary, called me every few weeks to check in. "You're going through what the mystics call the dark night of the soul," he said, "when everything you thought you knew about your relationship with God gets stripped away. It's painful, but it can also be transformative." "I don't feel very transformed," I admitted. "I mostly feel lost." "That's because you're in the middle of it. But Michael, you chose truth over comfort. That's what the prophets did. That's what Jesus did. It doesn't mean it won't hurt." The hardest part was the silence from my family. My brother Patrick, a devout Catholic and father of 4, stopped speaking to me entirely. My sister Catherine sent one text message after the trial. "I'm glad the girl is safe, but I wish you'd found another way." But there was no other way. That was the truth I kept coming back to. 6 months after the trial, I received an unexpected call from Bishop Morrison. "Michael," he said, his voice careful and formal, "I'd like to meet with you. Are you available this week?" We met at a small diner on the outskirts of Millbrook, far from prying eyes and the gossip mill. The bishop looked older than when I'd last seen him, more grey in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes. The weight of shepherding a divided diocese had taken its toll. "I'll get straight to the point," he said after we'd ordered coffee. "The Vatican has been reviewing your case. There are those in Rome who believe you should be excommunicated entirely, cut off from the church completely, but there are others who see the complexity of what you faced." "And which side are you on, Bishop?" He sighed heavily. "Honestly, I don't know anymore. A year ago I would have said you committed an unforgivable violation. But since then I've spoken with dozens of abuse survivors. I've read their letters. I've heard their stories. And I've had to ask myself some very hard questions about how the church has handled these situations." He stirred his coffee, not meeting my eyes. "We've prioritized protecting the institution over protecting the victims. I can't deny that anymore. We've hidden behind the seal of confession, behind canonical processes, behind the argument that we're being persecuted, all while children suffered. So what happens now? You remain laicized. That decision stands. But the Vatican has decided not to pursue excommunication. You're still Catholic, Michael. You can receive the sacraments. You can participate in parish life. You just can't serve as a priest." It was more than I'd expected, honestly. But it still felt like exile. "There's something else," the bishop continued. "I've been working with the state legislature on new protocols for clergy reporting requirements. Vermont is considering a law that would eliminate the confessional privilege exception for child abuse cases. I'm not fighting it." I looked at him in surprise. "The church won't fight it. Some dioceses will, but not here. I've come to believe that if we're serious about protecting children, we can't create legal loopholes that protect abusers. If someone confesses to ongoing abuse of a child, the priest should be required to report it, period. That's a significant change in position. Your case forced me to change. It forced a lot of us to change. He finally met my eyes. I'm not saying you were right to break the seal under the current rules, but I am saying that maybe the rules need to change. Maybe the seal was never meant to protect ongoing crimes. It was the closest thing to validation I'd received from the church hierarchy, and it meant more than I'd expected. But the conversation also made me realize something. The debate I'd sparked wasn't going to be resolved in my lifetime. This was a fundamental tension in religious practice, the balance between sacred tradition and moral obligation, between institutional loyalty and individual conscience. Over the following months, I watched as the ripple effects of my decision continued to spread. Several states introduced legislation modifying clergy reporting requirements. Catholic dioceses across the country updated their training materials for priests, emphasizing the legal obligations to report abuse even when it created tension with religious practice. I also began speaking publicly, though cautiously. Child advocacy organizations invited me to share my story. I spoke at a conference for mandated reporters, at a training session for law enforcement on religious communities, at a gathering of abuse survivors. I tried to be balanced in these talks. I didn't claim to have all the answers. I acknowledged the legitimate concerns about religious freedom and the importance of protecting spiritual practices, but I also insisted on one non-negotiable point. The safety of children had to come first. I don't regret my decision, I would tell these audiences, but I don't judge other priests who might make a different choice when faced with a similar situation. What I do judge, what we all should judge, is a system that ever puts religious leaders in a position where protecting a child feels like a violation of their sacred duty. That's a failure of the system, not the individual. Emma Richardson's family invited me to dinner one evening. Emma herself was doing better, still in therapy, still healing, but growing stronger. She'd returned to school, made new friends, and was slowly rebuilding her sense of safety in the world. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said to me after dinner when the adults were having coffee. "Of course. Why did you tell? Everyone says priests aren't supposed to." It was the most direct and important question anyone had asked me. I thought carefully about how to answer an 11-year-old girl, because keeping you safe was more important than any rule. Sometimes adults have to make really hard choices, and the right choice isn't always the easy one, or the one everyone agrees with. A year and a half after that fateful confession, I received a letter that would change my perspective again. It came from a maximum security prison in northern Vermont, written in careful handwriting on lined paper. The return address showed it was from Robert Hastings. My first instinct was to throw it away. What could he possibly have to say to me? What explanation or justification could matter? But something made me open it. "Father Brennan," it began. He still called me Father, even though I no longer was. "I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything except perhaps for you to throw this letter in the trash where it belongs, along with me. But I need to tell you something. For the first year I was in here, I hated you. I blamed you for everything. I told myself that I would have stopped on my own, that I came to confession seeking help, and you betrayed me. I convinced myself that you were the villain in this story. It's what I had to believe to survive the guilt. But I've been in intensive therapy here, mandated by the court, but I've actually engaged with it. And my therapist asked me a question I couldn't answer. If you were genuinely seeking help to stop, why didn't you turn yourself in like Father Brennan asked? I didn't have a good answer. The truth is, I came to confession hoping for absolution without consequences. I wanted God's forgiveness without having to face what I'd done. I wanted the guilt to go away without actually stopping or facing justice. I wanted magic words to fix what I'd broken. That's not repentance. That's cowardice. You did what I should have done. You protected Emma when I was harming her. You had the courage I didn't have. I think about her every day. I know I destroyed something precious and innocent, something that can never be fully repaired. I know that no amount of time in prison, no amount of therapy, no amount of remorse can undo what I did to her. But because of you, she's safe now. Because of you, she's getting help. Because of you, she knows it wasn't her fault. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I needed you to know that somewhere in this prison, a man who hurt a child has finally understood what he did, and that wouldn't have happened if you'd stayed silent. You saved Emma, and maybe, in some small way, you saved me too, not from prison, but from continuing to be a monster. Robert. I read the letter 3 times, sitting at my small kitchen table. My emotions were complicated, tangled. Could I believe him? Was this genuine remorse or manipulation? Could someone who'd done what he did truly change? I didn't know, but I saved the letter, because it reminded me of something important. My choice hadn't just been about law versus religious tradition, or even about protecting one child. It had been about truth, about refusing to let darkness hide behind sacred walls, about insisting that faith should make us more accountable, not less. The national conversation continued to evolve. By late 2020, 5 states had passed laws eliminating confessional privilege in cases of child abuse. The Catholic Church's response varied wildly. Some dioceses adapted, others fought in court. Still others quietly trained priests in how to navigate the new legal landscape. I also started writing, at first just for myself, processing my experiences, my doubts, my pain. But eventually, with encouragement from David Martinez, I began writing articles for religious journals and newspapers. I wrote about the tension between institutional loyalty and prophetic witness. I wrote about how religious communities could better protect children without abandoning their traditions. I wrote about the importance of moral courage, even when it costs us everything. One piece I wrote for a Catholic publication went semi-viral. It was titled, "When the Seal Must Break, a Former Priest's Defense of Conscience." In it, I argued that the seal of confession was never meant to protect ongoing crimes, that the sacrament's purpose was to facilitate genuine repentance and transformation, not to provide cover for continued abuse, that if confession became a shield for predators, then we'd perverted the sacrament beyond recognition. Jesus welcomed sinners, I wrote, but he also overturned the tables of those who exploited religion for their own benefit. He prioritized mercy over ritual, people over rules, protection of the vulnerable over preservation of institutional power. If breaking a centuries-old tradition is what it takes to protect a child, then I believe Jesus would hand me the hammer. The article generated thousands of responses. Some accused me of trying to justify my betrayal. Others thanked me for articulating what they'd felt but couldn't express. The debate raged on, but something else was happening too. I was finding a new sense of purpose. 2 years after Emma's rescue, I found myself doing something I never expected, training other clergy members on recognizing and responding to abuse. It started small. A Methodist minister in Millbrook asked if I'd speak to his congregation about warning signs of child abuse. Then a rabbi from Burlington asked me to lead a workshop for religious leaders on mandated reporting laws. Word spread, and soon I was receiving invitations from across New England. I partnered with child protection organizations, law enforcement, and legal experts to develop training programs. We taught clergy members how to recognize grooming behaviors, how to create safe environments for children, how to navigate the legal requirements in their states, and how to balance their spiritual duties with their legal obligations. I'm not here to tell you to break confessional seals, I would say in these trainings. I'm here to help you avoid ever being in the position I was in. Prevention is always better than intervention. We focused on practical strategies, background checks for volunteers, 2 adult rules for children's programs, clear reporting protocols, and most importantly, creating cultures where children felt safe speaking up. The goal, I'd explain, is to make your faith community so safe, so transparent, so committed to child protection that abusers don't even try to hide there. And if they do, that they're caught before anyone gets hurt. The work was meaningful, but it was also painful. Every training meant reliving my story, facing questions about my choices, defending decisions I still sometimes question myself. But I kept doing it because I'd meet people like Father Thomas Chen, a young Catholic priest in Massachusetts who attended one of my workshops. He approached me during a break, looking troubled. "I heard something concerning from a teenager in my youth group," he said quietly. "Not in confession, just in conversation. She hinted that her uncle makes her uncomfortable. I don't have any proof of abuse, but what should I do?" We talked through the situation. I helped him understand his reporting obligations, how to approach the conversation with the teen, how to contact protective services. 2 weeks later, he emailed me. The investigation had uncovered ongoing abuse, and the girl was now safe. "You helped me see that protecting her wasn't a betrayal of my ministry," he wrote. "It was the fulfillment of it." These moments made everything worthwhile. I also reconnected with Emma Richardson and her family. Linda asked if I'd be willing to meet with Emma periodically, not as a priest, but as someone who'd been part of her story, someone who'd believed her when it mattered most. Our conversations were simple. Sometimes we'd get ice cream and talk about school. Sometimes we'd walk in the park and she'd tell me about her friends. Sometimes she'd ask me questions about faith, about forgiveness, about how to trust people again. "Do you think God is mad at you for breaking that rule?" she asked me one day. She was 13 now, more confident than the frightened 11-year-old I'd first heard about. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I hope not. I think God cares more about protecting kids like you than about protecting traditions, but I guess I won't know for sure until I meet him." She considered this. "I think he's probably proud of you. You gave up everything to help me. That seems like something Jesus would do." Out of the mouths of children. My brother Patrick finally reached out to me that same year. He called one evening, his voice thick with emotion. "I need to apologize," he said. "I've been thinking about what you did, and I realized something. If someone knew one of my kids was being abused and didn't tell me because of some rule, I'd never forgive them. You did what any decent person should do. I'm sorry it took me so long to see that." We met for dinner the following week, beginning the slow process of rebuilding our relationship. Family gatherings were awkward at first, but gradually became easier. My nephews and nieces, who'd been kept away from me, were allowed to visit again. Life was slowly, painfully reconstructing itself around a new identity. I wasn't Father Michael Brennan anymore. I was just Michael. But maybe that was enough. Maybe that had always been enough. I continued attending St. Catherine's occasionally, though I'd found a new spiritual home at a small Episcopal church that welcomed my complicated history. The Episcopal priest, Mother Sarah Williams, had followed my case and offered me a place without judgment. "We're a church of second chances," she said, "and of people who chose conscience over comfort. You're welcome here." In that community, I found healing I hadn't experienced in months. I found people who understood that faith sometimes meant difficult choices, that following God sometimes meant standing alone, that doing the right thing sometimes meant losing everything. 3 years after that fateful confession, on a crisp October morning, I received a call from ADA Jennifer Walsh. "Michael, I thought you should know. Emma just testified at a legislative hearing. She's advocating for stronger child protection laws. She mentioned you by name, thanked you publicly. I thought you'd want to know." 5 years after I broke the seal of confession, I stood in a small community center in Millbrook, Vermont, preparing to give a talk titled "The Cost of Truth: Lessons in Moral Courage." The room was packed with people from all walks of life: clergy members, social workers, teachers, parents, abuse survivors, and curious community members. Emma Richardson sat in the third row with her mother, now 16 years old and thriving. She'd become an advocate for child protection laws, speaking at schools and community events about recognizing abuse and finding the courage to speak up. I'd been invited to share my story and the lessons I'd learned. As I looked out at the audience, I thought about the journey that had brought me here, from the darkness of a confessional booth to this moment of shared understanding. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "My name is Michael Brennan. I used to be a priest. 5 years ago, I made a decision that cost me my priesthood, divided my community, and changed my life forever. Today, I want to share what I've learned from that experience. First, truth is not always comfortable, and doing the right thing is not always easy. When I heard that confession, I faced an impossible choice, or at least a choice that felt impossible. But the truth is, when we know a child is in danger, there's only one moral choice. Protecting that child comes first, always. Second, institutions are made of people, and people can be wrong. I love the Catholic Church. It shaped who I am, taught me about service and sacrifice, gave my life meaning for over 2 decades. But institutions can develop blind spots. They can prioritize self-preservation over truth. They can confuse tradition with morality. When that happens, we have a responsibility to speak up, even when it costs us. Third, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite the fear. I was terrified when I made that phone call to Detective Chen. I knew what it would cost. I knew how my life would change. But I also knew that Emma Richardson's safety mattered more than my comfort, my career, or my reputation. Fourth, healing takes time for everyone involved. Emma is doing well now, but she'll carry the impact of what happened to her for the rest of her life. The community of Millbrook is still healing from the division and pain. I'm still healing from the loss of my priesthood and identity. Healing isn't linear, and it's never complete, but it is possible. Fifth, prevention is always better than intervention. Since this happened, I've dedicated my life to helping religious communities create safe environments where abuse can't take root. If you're a religious leader, a teacher, a coach, or anyone who works with children, please invest in prevention. Background checks, training, clear policies, open communication. Make your spaces so safe that predators can't operate there. Sixth, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing. Robert Hastings wrote to me from prison. I've wrestled with how to respond to that letter, how to think about his remorse. Here's what I've learned. Forgiveness is possible, but it doesn't erase consequences. It doesn't mean what he did was okay. It means acknowledging that people are complex, that change is possible, and that holding on to hatred hurts us more than it hurts them. Finally, and most importantly, your voice matters. If you see something wrong, speak up. If you know a child is in danger, act. Don't wait for someone else to be the hero. Don't assume someone else will handle it. You might face criticism. You might lose friends. You might face consequences you never imagined, but you'll also know that you did the right thing, and sometimes that has to be enough. Emma Richardson saved me as much as I saved her. She reminded me why any of this matters. She showed me that courage comes in many forms: the courage to report, the courage to testify, the courage to heal, and the courage to advocate for others. I lost my priesthood 5 years ago, but I found my purpose. I learned that ministry isn't defined by a collar or a title. It's defined by how we show up for the most vulnerable among us. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this. When you're faced with a choice between protecting an institution and protecting a child, choose the child. Every single time. No tradition, no rule, no law is more important than a child's safety. The consequences may be severe, the criticism may be harsh, but you'll be able to look at yourself in the mirror. You'll be able to sleep at night. And most importantly, a child will be safe because you had the courage to act. That's a trade I'd make again, 1,000 times over. As I finished, the room erupted in applause. People stood. Emma was crying, her mother's arm around her shoulders. Several clergy members in the audience wiped their eyes. After the talk, people lined up to speak with me. A young woman in her 20s approached, tears streaming down her face. "I was abused by a youth pastor when I was 14, she said. "I told my priest, but he said I shouldn't tell anyone else because it would hurt the church's reputation. Thank you for showing that some people choose differently." An elderly Catholic man shook my hand firmly. "I've been Catholic my whole life. I thought you were wrong at first, but my granddaughter is 7 years old. If someone knew she was being hurt and didn't tell me because of some rule, I could never forgive that. You did right." A young priest approached hesitantly. "I'm terrified I'll face the same situation you did," he admitted. "How do I prepare for that?" "Work to make sure it never happens," I told him. "Create a culture in your parish where abuse can't hide. Train your staff. Listen to children. Make reporting easy. And if you do face what I faced, trust your conscience. The rule was made to serve people, not the other way around." As the evening ended and people filtered out, Emma approached me. "Thank you for coming to my talk last month," she said, "and thank you for everything. Not just for saving me, but for teaching me that doing the right thing matters more than doing the easy thing." "You've taken that lesson further than I ever could," I said. "You're changing laws, you're changing minds, you're protecting kids I'll never meet." "We're doing it together," she said. "You started it. I'm just continuing it." As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the long, painful journey from that October evening in a confessional booth to this moment. I thought about what I'd lost: my priesthood, my identity, my sense of belonging to an institution I'd loved. But I also thought about what I'd gained: a clearer conscience, a new purpose, and the knowledge that one child was safe because I'd found the courage to act. I'd made peace with my choice. Not because it was easy, or because everyone agreed with it, or because I'd escaped consequences, but because when I closed my eyes at night, I saw Emma Richardson's face, not the terrified 11-year-old in danger, but the strong 16-year-old advocate she'd become. That was enough. Some truths are worth losing everything for. Some silences must be broken, no matter the cost. Some choices, once made, define who we truly are. I'd faced the judgment of the church. I'd faced the judgment of my community. I'd faced the judgment of the courts. But most importantly, I could face the judgment of my own conscience. And when my time comes to face whatever judgment awaits beyond this life, I'll stand by what I did. I protected a child. I spoke the truth. I chose mercy over law. If that damns me, then I'll accept that damnation, knowing I'd make the same choice again. But I don't believe it will. I believe that whatever God is, whatever form divine judgment takes, it values the protection of the innocent above the preservation of rules. The seal of confession is sacred, but so is the life of a child. And when those two things conflict, I know which one I'll choose, every single time. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Stories like this don't just happen in small Vermont towns. They happen everywhere, in communities just like yours. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city name in the comments below. Your perspective matters, and I read every response. Together, we can keep the conversation about protecting children going. See you in the next story. Touching stories.